No, I ain't heard him. Hello, hello. couldn't really start talking until the bell rang because I don't want to work any overtime tonight. But it is good to see everyone tonight. I know you all have gone and got your milk and your eggs and your bread so you can make French toast if you get snowed in. And so the afternoon class today is mostly made up of folks who are retired. Well, it's all made up of folks that are retired. And so we were all joking. I said, y'all got to hurry up and get out of here so y'all can go to the grocery store here in a little bit and stock up on stuff. So maybe we won't get it too bad at all. We're going to finish up the first phase of our study tonight of the backgrounds of the New Testament, and then we'll move in next week to our section about looking at Paul's journeys and what can we look at about those, and look at the cultural context of many of those situations that may help us understand that better. And so tonight, just kind of reviewing a little bit that we started out with this last week, is during the intermission of the time between the Testaments, a great many things happened that shaped the theology and the beliefs of the Jews, and really, to be honest with you, of the New Testament, which was written, we think, pretty much predominantly by Jews. Maybe some argument made about Luke in that equation, but very Jewish belief. The early days of Christianity are very Jewish in their orientation, but a lot of things impacted that. And we talked a little bit about literature. We see the Hebrew Bible is translated into Greek. We have a lot of books called the Old Testament Apocrypha that are composed in pseudepigrapha. I told you you will spell an exam on that later on. And also paraphrases of the Bible translated into Aramaic. We'll talk tonight about these sects. We won't talk about the Essenes because they're not mentioned in the New Testament, but they were a sect of Jews that lived, we think, out near Qumran. Some people think they're responsible for the Dead Sea Scrolls. We don't know that for sure, but that's kind of the general consensus. But we'll talk about some of those. I probably won't talk about zealots in depth, but I'll mention what they are. We'll talk about the Sanhedrin, the council of about 70. We definitely see them mentioned, and of course the synagogue, which is heavily mentioned in the New Testament. Our sources for this information are not diverse. Josephus is one. The New Testament, of course, is a source for a lot of information out there. Even if you don't believe in Christianity or believe in God or believe in Jesus, if you were looking and just simply examining the religious world of the first century, you'd probably read the New Testament, or at least the narrative portions of it, to learn from that. Josephus it's always interesting to me. People really look at Josephus and say, well, if he said it, it has to be true. Well, you have to subject Josephus's writings to textual criticism, meaning Josephus, the oldest copy we have of Josephus is only 1,000 years old, which means it's 1,000 years younger than Josephus writing it. So it's been copied and copied and copied and copied. And so we have to be careful acting like we have the originals of Josephus, just like we don't have the originals of the New Testament. Many different scrolls that are found in the Judean desert, not just at Qumran, with what are commonly referred to as the Dead Sea Scrolls, but there are other locations in the desert. If you want a manuscript made of animal material to last a long time, hot, arid, dry places are good places to put those. The Bible would have never survived in Louisiana. It would never have made it. Some people refer often to rabbinic writings, and I put an asterisk next to that because I think that's a mistake. Because most of those writings and most of the things that say, well, the Jews did this, or the Jews believed that, or this is how they did things, are written really close to maybe 100 to 200 years after the time of Jesus. And so that's like saying everything in America is just like it was in the 1800s. And so the things are different. And so I think those are a little cautious when people, I take those with a little bit of caution. They may or may not indicate the belief of the Jews at that time. We'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about Pharisees. And then we have to remember how things have changed. Those who had hegemony, when we leave the Old Testament narrative in the days of Ezra and Nehemiah, which is in the middle of the 5th century, Persia is over the area that we would refer to as Palestine. They are over a gigantic area of land, all the way from modern-day Greece, North Africa, Egypt, Libya, all the way over to India. And then along come the Greeks, and they take that over. Alexander the Great leads his great conquest in the 4th century and takes over that. That's why your New Testament is written in Greek. That's why we see things like Hellenists and other Greek influences in the New Testament. For a brief period, the Jews rebelled against their Greek overlords and ruled themselves and it's typically called the Hasmonean era. They corrupted the priesthood. There's a lot of things they did that were not good, but they essentially did rule themselves. Some of you may have heard about the Maccabean rebellion. That results in this Hasmonean rule until the Romans take over, and that's who's in charge of the New Testament period. The Roman general Pompey conquered Jerusalem about 63 BCE, and so that's when we really see Rome beginning to control things. Even kings like Herod were really just puppet kings of the Roman Empire. So thinking about stuff we want to understand the New Testament, we will try to understand as much as we can about these things, because as I said, our sources are limited. And in some cases, they're very biased. And so we'll talk about that as we go through. But the Samaritans are very important for us to understand things in the Gospels and also in the book of Acts, where we see, for example, Philip go and take the gospel to the Samaritans. It seems like Jesus' relationship with the Samaritans is sometimes very cordial. Sometimes they don't want him there, and sometimes he don't want to send his disciples there. But it's a group of people that are mentioned very often. So it's important for us to understand what we can about that. And so really, it's a story some 700 years in the making. Traditionally, many people believe the Samaritans are the descendants of the people that came in, the Assyrians, when they conquered the northern kingdom of Israel and the capital city of Samaria, that they deported a lot of the Jews, but they left some there, and then they moved in their people to take over, to manage the area, to farm the land, to do things. And of course, they interbred with one another. And so some believe that that is the case with the Samaritans. We don't know that for sure. And of course, that's 7 centuries before the New Testament. So it's a little bit rough to even think that that held true, that those same people and they descended from that same group of people. But that's kind of traditionally where it would come from. You know, by the time you get to Jesus' time, for somebody to be able to raise their hand and say, I am purely Jewish with not a single Gentile in the entire woodpile, would be an absurd statement to make. Even Jesus could not make that statement, because he has Ruth, who is a Moabite, in his genealogy. And so even Jesus could make the claim that he was pure Jewish with nobody outside of that going there. 2 Kings 17 is the text that you'll see. We can think the Samaritans, they did have their own copy or version of the Torah. It's mostly referred to today as you might read it in a commentary or in a study Bible, or even maybe in some footnotes in your English Bible if you got a good English Bible. The Samaritan Pentateuch, as sometimes people call it the Pentateuch, meaning the book of 5, they had a little bit, their version was slightly different, but it's very beneficial for us to have it in textual studies of the Hebrew Bible, because we can look and say, okay, well, the Samaritan Pentateuch is very, very old, and we have some very, very old copies of it, and so we can kind of look at it. Sometimes it helps us better understand and deduce readings in the Hebrew Bible that we have, because we don't have nearly as many copies of Hebrew manuscripts as we do of New Testament Greek manuscripts, and so all the help we can have is good. Some things are different in that book. The temple there on the Mount Gerizim that Jesus and the woman at the well talk about, when she says, remember, our ancestors worshipped on this mountain, and there was a temple on that mountain. It would have been destroyed by the time of Jesus. The ruins are still there. But she said, you Jews say you should worship in Jerusalem. Well, if you remember, Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal are the 2 mountains that they got on for the blessings and the curses when they were going to the Promised Land in Deuteronomy. One issued curses, one issued blessings from that. So they thought you worshipped on Mount Gerizim. They had a temple there. That's not the only difference in their beliefs. But look, they believed in Yahweh, the God of Israel. And they believed that he had selected his people from Abraham, all of those things. So they're really not all that far afield in doing that, but looked at very, very negatively by what I might call the mainstream Jews. It's important for us to know that some major stories I just mentioned. The woman at the well, which is a very, very frequent biblical motif, especially in the Old Testament. Lots of things happen with women at wells. A lot of times people meet the woman of their dreams at a well, or somebody's servant goes and gets the woman of their dreams and brings them back to them. But we have very important discussion. I love the discussion that Jesus has with this woman. It's one of my favorite narratives in all of the New Testament because most of the men that ever talk with Jesus, they just can't understand it. This woman just keeps toe-to-toe with him. No matter what he says, she just fires right back at him. And so she's much better and much more fun to read than some of the men that just fold up like a cheap suit whenever Jesus confronts them about something, or somebody like Nicodemus who just can't understand anything Jesus is telling him. This woman's like, okay, well, you say that, well, let me tell you this. Well, what about this? What about that? And going through that. We also see the parable of the Good Samaritan. I think just about everybody in the English-speaking world has heard of that, even if you don't believe in the Bible. We even have laws named after that, nicknamed the Good Samaritan laws, that keep you from getting sued when you try to save somebody's life. And in Luke 17, we look at the 10 lepers that Jesus healed. You remember how many came back? One. And you know what? He was a Samaritan, the text tells us. So when we look at the New Testament, obviously I haven't exhausted everything there. There's a common dislike. We see that in Matthew 10, Luke chapter 9, and even being called a Samaritan is viewed as an insult in John chapter 8. And so it's a very, very negative portrayal made of these. But Jesus doesn't seem to hate these people. He sometimes they don't want him in their villages. They tell him not to come because his, quote, face is set towards Jerusalem, meaning he's more concerned with the Jews, perhaps they feel. But ultimately, the gospel is taken to the people in Samaria. They were even accused, and we have no idea if this is true. Antiochus IV Epiphanes was a Greek king over that area who defiled the temple. He slaughtered a pig on the altar to Jupiter. He prohibited women from circumcising their children and killed their babies if they did. He was a terrible person. He tried to really kind of stamp out Judaism, if you will. And so somebody accused these Samaritans of being his cohorts and co-conspirators. We have no idea if that's true at all. Whenever we read something written by somebody's enemy, we need to be kind of careful about whether or not we believe that or not. Unfortunately, Samaritans just didn't give us a lot of literature to understand what they believe. It's not like what we have like at Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls, some of them are biblical manuscripts, but many of them are community documents about their ideas and how they lived and their asceticism, everything about that. We can know a little bit more about them as a people. Samaritans, we kind of have to rely on external sources. They claim, however, they would claim that they are the Samarim, the keepers, saying, hey, we kept the faith in God when the rest of you went to idolatry, and that's why God had the northern kingdom conquered. We kept the faith during that time. We stayed the course. Now, once again, that may be something they're claiming, and they're talking about people 700 years back. But they were, I had a professor ask me one time, were the Samaritans Jews? And that's a really tough question to think about, because are you talking about ethnic Jews? Or are you talking about religious Jews? Or are you talking about partially ethnic Jews? What did they believe in? Was their religion different? And so it is a very, very challenging question. And we can understand today where we have many different Christian traditions, all who believe in the same God and all who believe in Jesus and his death on the cross and his mission here and that he was the Son of God, but still come to different conclusions and have variety of beliefs. And even over a long time span of 20 centuries of Christianity, how that has varied. Even within the first 100 years of Christianity, how much that varied and changed all the way across the board until what we usually refer to as Orthodox Christianity winning out. But they were worthy of the good news, and Philip carries the gospel to Samaria where it seems to be received in Acts chapter 8, verses 4 through 25. And so just a little background, they were a little bit religiously different, but I would call them Jews. I would say they're probably just about as faithful Jews as most of the people that Jesus encounters, with some different beliefs and a variety in their beliefs. And so one of the things that's interesting to think about is, why did they have these different beliefs? Why did they have a different Torah? What are the origins of that? Where does that come from? So that's a challenging thing that we don't necessarily know the answers to. So we're introduced to them. I want to give you a little bit of background about that. But it's important that we understand they're really kind of a different ethnic/religious group of Jews. Certainly you cannot read the Gospels without reading about Pharisees. It's also, we know that Paul was a Pharisee and the child of Pharisees. And so it's very important that we understand a little bit about Pharisees. And they're really kind of normally called the party of the people, if you will. I understand there was close to about 6,000 people. I have no idea where people pulled that number from because I don't think they took roll. But sometimes they are more numerous than the Sadducees that you might see. Some scholars think their origins are somewhere about in the last half or the very beginning, the very end of the 4th century, beginning of the 3rd century. But definitely they seem to be pretty prominent by about 150 years before the time of the New Testament. So, but they're not something that goes way back. You're not going to find Pharisees in your Old Testament. Keep in mind, the Second Temple Judaism is what we typically refer to that period after the Jews are restored from exile in Babylon and Zerubbabel rebuilds the temple. You can read about that in Ezra. Now, Ezra was not around when they rebuilt the temple, but that story is contained in the Ezra-Nehemiah narrative. Second Temple Judaism and that system of Judaism was not the same system that David followed. Or that maybe even Ezra followed. There's a lot of changes that go through. Not that the Torah is not the law anymore, it certainly is, but they began to try to understand it and dissect it and bring some of these things to light and study on it a little bit more. But we see the rise of a messianic expectation. A lot of things happened in that time between the testaments that we have here. Some believe that their origin of their name, is from a Hebrew word called parash, which means to separate or to distinguish. And the Pharisees certainly tried to do that, mostly through their pious behavior and keeping the law and trying to keep the oral traditions that they believed as well. The primary difference, most people think the primary difference between Pharisees and Sadducees is, well, the Sadducees don't believe in resurrection. Okay, we know that because the New Testament tells us that. But a major difference between the two of them, and it very much mimics what I might say might be the difference between Protestant Christianity today and Eastern Orthodox Christianity and perhaps even Roman Catholicism, is they believed in an oral and a written Torah. Now, the written part would be what we're familiar with, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Torah does not mean law. Torah means instruction. And so you have the written Torah. Moses got that from God. Traditionally, it's Moses that's the author of the Torah. And he wrote those things down. And they've been passed along in written form all the way for 1,500 years by the time of Jesus. However, there was also understood to be an oral set of laws and tradition and instructions that were given to Moses and then were passed down by the elders of Israel for generation after generation to the people. They eventually become codified in a document called the Mishnah. And so the Mishnah is a set of this oral laws. There's commentary on that called the Gemara or Gemara that are combined to what is called the Talmud today in Rabbinic Judaism. So you have the oral Torah and you have a commentary on it. You can get a copy of that. If you want a copy of the Mishnah, it exists. If you want a copy of the Talmud, you're going to spend a lot of money or get it electronically because it's like buying a set of encyclopedias that you will get. So a major difference is they believed in what we might refer to today as traditions. We see in English translations of the Bible, they're accused of keeping traditions of men, if you will, rather than the law. And so we think about that. Greek Orthodox and to some extent today not only believe in the New Testament as Scripture, but also believe that in the church fathers and patristic writings is preserved the teachings and thoughts and theology of all the things that were said to Christians, like in Paul's probably preached hundreds of sermons that we don't have written down. Can you imagine how many times Paul taught in Ephesus over 2 years, or in Corinth for a year and a half, or all these other places that we have none of that information, that was kind of an oral tradition that was handed down by patristic writers who were like church fathers of the early centuries of Christianity. Now, Protestants don't follow that thought process, and whether you want to admit it or not, you're a Protestant group of Christians. And so that was a little bit like maybe what Pharisees would do if you think about something in a modern day sense. They definitely believed in external piety, meaning fasting, which, they're pretty important. Jesus says, hey, why do you go fasting? You make your face look all terrible while you're fasting. Tithing, making sure and that's something that was said to be done. Tithing was ordered in the Torah, meaning you're giving a tenth of your produce. It's not really a financial thing all the time. It's a tenth of your produce. And also keeping observances. Remember how bent out of shape they get when Jesus violates one of their observances, especially the Sabbath. They get very upset about that. But they believe in their external keeping of the commandments of God is their piety. They did believe in a resurrection. They believed in an afterlife. My understanding is they believed in angels, which are God's messengers, and they believed in fate and free will. And so that's very important. Resurrection is typically the one that's talked about the most. Some familiar Pharisees, Gamaliel, Nicodemus, and of course, as I mentioned earlier, Paul. I don't think that the Pharisees were evil people. I don't think the Sadducees were evil people. Or maybe they had some evil people amongst them, just like any group of religious people today, including Christians, who misuse and abuse God's Scripture and lead people astray for their own personal gain. That's gone on for years and years in Christianity. I do believe that they may have been misguided in some ways. They may have gone too far, whatever they want to do. But I don't think they hated God. I don't think they didn't believe in the Torah or any of those things. I believe they were very, very good Jews who were honestly in their hearts trying to do what was right and to please Yahweh. I don't have any doubt about that at all. The fact that they didn't like Jesus or were irritated by Jesus, that doesn't necessarily, they just may have misunderstood him. They may not have understood him. They've been jealous of him, whatever it is. But remember, the guy we love named Paul, he didn't believe Jesus either. He didn't believe him at all. He thought these people were there to tear down Yahweh and that they were blasphemers and negative things. Gamaliel was a good guy. Nicodemus was a good guy. And so we don't want to paint a picture that they were evil people, even though they were angry about Jesus. They may just not have understood what Jesus was there to do. And he was wrecking and throwing the train off the tracks of things that they had believed. The Pharisaic belief system really wound up being the winning system in a different system. After the Bar Kokhba rebellion against the Romans in 135 CE, which was the last attempt, the big rebellion in 70 CE resulted in the temple being destroyed. The Jews tried again and lost in 135 CE, and that was the end of that. After that, emperors like Hadrian renamed Jerusalem. They tore it apart. They said, we're done. They had done a whole long time of treating the Jews very, very good. After that, rabbinic Judaism kind of emerges, and that's what Pharisaic beliefs kind of molded into. So most people say some version of the Pharisees wound up winning out and becoming what would be rabbinic Judaism all through the Middle Ages and even into today. The Sadducees are mentioned not as often as they were. Sometimes they're together against Jesus and sometimes against Paul, and sometimes Paul pits them against each other to throw them off his trail in doing that. But we have another party that we see, and they're mainly an aristocratic group of priests very much associated with the temple. We do not know where they came from. Some scholars think the name is based on the Zadokite priesthood that we see back in the times of David, but we don't know that. We don't really know where in the world their name comes from. Potentially, what we know about them is somewhat negatively biased. Josephus in the New Testament are our primary sources against them. I do not expect the New Testament to be friendly to Sadducees because Sadducees weren't friendly to Jesus. So I don't expect it to paint a rosy picture of them. And by my understanding is Josephus leaned towards the Pharisees, and so he probably doesn't give us a really good picture of the Sadducees as well. So I'm always a little bit suspect of that information. But it's the best we got, and so we'll kind of stick with what we know. There's no question they were definitely closely associated with the priesthood and the temple. That's where we see them a lot in there. Probably not as many of these guys as there were of the Pharisees. Some scholars believe that they were an aristocratic group of people, probably men of means and some measure of wealth, and seemed to be politically strong. Well, that kind of goes hand in hand, right? If you got money, then you're usually politically strong. If you don't have any money, politicians really could care less about you. They'll tell you they care about you, but they really don't care about you at all. And so these guys, maybe with the money and having a good deal of political influence, also keeping the temple, Jews under control. Look, the Roman governor of Judea, we know one of them is Pontius Pilate, who didn't last very long. The last thing you want there to do is to be discord. What you don't want Caesar to hear anything about you. All you want to know is the taxes are coming in and nobody's rebelling. A quiet province is a great province. And so getting along with these Jewish leadership is just a good political move to say, hey, whatever, we just need to do things, keep things under control, keep people calmed down, because Judea was a powder keg for rebellion. Eventually it does come to fruition some 40 years after Jesus conducts his ministry, but that's not what somebody wants. And so getting along with the Jewish leadership is wise in many ways. Some people think the Romans were terribly oppressive. They weren't necessarily the case at all times. Most of the time they just wanted you to pay your taxes put people in the military, and they excused the Jews of that, and to not rebel. I did read a couple of people who thought they were more open to Hellenism, which is like Greek philosophy, way of life, culture, in that way, and that they were cooperative with the Romans. Now, I don't know about that. I mean, Josephus was a traitor to the Jews, in my opinion, and sided with the Romans. Josephus is his Roman name, more so than his Jewish name. So I don't know what that accusation even means, but it would be something viewed negatively by zealots and those kind of people there. They only believed in the written Torah, so they would be like a sola scriptura group of people. Only the written Torah. They did not believe in this oral tradition that the Pharisees believed in. So that's a real big difference between the two of them. I am unclear on how they viewed the law and the prophets. You have to keep in mind, Jewish view of the scriptures and their inspiration differs perhaps from what we may think it is. Every pen stroke of the Torah is the inspired and holy word of God. The prophets, when they say, "Thus saith the Lord," are speaking God as his mouthpiece. And then when I get into, I should say, instead of unclear on law and prophets, it should say like the narrative and history and the prophets. That's a mistype there. I've changed that. So don't write that down. I have that on the screen incorrectly. But we think about like the Psalms, the prophets, the narrative of the Bible. A lot of those things are not necessarily viewed as infallible maybe or as holy as we might view them at. But definitely the first 5 books, those are the laws of God, and that's what we're going to follow. I've got to try to remember to change that tomorrow. They did reject fate, in my understanding, meaning that kind of like deism in Christianity, that God has wound up the world and everything's predetermined. All the endings everything's going to already work out. You can't change those things. And thinking about those things, resurrection, afterlife, they didn't believe in it. My understanding is that they just believed you died. Now, it kind of makes me admire the Sadducees, and I've told many classes this, and you're like, why would that make you admire them? Well, they wanted to do what was right in the sight of God with no promise of anything in the afterlife. I would love to see how many Christians would continue their faith if there was no promise of the afterlife. I think we would have plenty of room in this church building for all the growth we ever needed, because most Christians, if they knew there was no reward for them of heaven, would abandon their faith very quickly. But remember, it's not necessarily a Jewish belief that we're striving for heaven. We're striving for a restoration of our land. We want God to restore the land that he gave to us. Now, whether that's in some Edenic paradise or some utopian world or whatever that may wind up being, the land is what we are looking for. A concept of heaven, like we have a concept of heaven, does not exist in the Old Testament. And so for Jews to be, now it does exist and rise in Second Temple Judaism, but keep in mind, they're not striving for that goal like we are and trying to get there. These guys, I kind of admire them, that they wanted to be obedient to God with nothing after that. And so I'm not even sure that I could even figure that out in my own head. They do seem to disappear from the scene after the temple is destroyed, because guess what? When your whole world revolves around the temple and there's no more temple, you kind of lose a lot of purpose in thinking through that. So once again, I don't know exactly how slowly they fell out of favor or disappeared or disbanded or whatever, because we just don't have a lot of information about that. I've seen books written on Pharisees and Sadducees that were like an inch thick, and I'm like, really? That's got to be a lot of speculation. It's like when I see a book this thick written about elders and deacons in the New Testament, I'm like, really? You have to be making up a lot to fill up 300 pages about something that doesn't take up maybe even a whole chapter in total. In the Bible. And so it's one of those things where I'm like, how do people make up so much about Sadducees? I think there's a lot of guesswork in there, and so hopefully I'm not giving you too much guesswork tonight. I apologize for looking at my watch. It's very rude, but the clock is not working up there, so I need to make sure what time it is here in a minute. We also see a group of people that I think maybe, based on best I can tell, the scribes and lawyers in English translation. There are different words in Greek for these two different groups, but they seem to be kind of the same thing, the best I can read. Now, we see scribes and lawyers, we think about people that take notes and people that you hire to represent you in court. Think about it in a little bit different way. But we should say a lawyer should be an expert in the law. This is from a religious perspective. And scribes, as you might tell, did a lot of copying of the law. Well, guess what happens when you copy something a lot? You may start to remember some of those things. You may be an expert in those things and writing them over and over again and training yourself to write them properly and taking great pride in doing that. So what I would say is both these people wind up being what we would call experts. The word lawyer, nomikos, nomos means law in Greek. It's only used one time in Matthew and 6 times in Luke, so it's not too prolific. Grammateus is used over 60 times in the Gospels, Acts, and in one time in 1 Corinthians. So a little bit more of a popular term. May be, like I said, talking 2 different words to describe the same group of people, but scribe is certainly something mentioned often. I think it's more than just a copyist. I think it's somebody who was regarded as an expert in the law and have become experts in the law. They are scholars of Torah and certainly other religious matters that they come to. Ezra is described in the Old Testament as both a priest and the scribe and skilled in the law of Moses. So I don't know if Ezra became an expert in the law because he wrote it down and copied it often. That is how people learn to memorize things. If you recall, or if you don't, you can go look. In Deuteronomy, any king of Israel, because God went ahead and anticipated back at the plains of Moab that Israel would ask for a king one day. So he says, when you do put a king over you, when you come to me and you want a king over you, which comes to fruition in the days of Samuel and Saul, when you want a king over you, here's what the king needs to do. And one of those requirements is to write for himself a copy of the Torah and get the priest to proofread it. Now, proofread is my modern day word, but get them to look over that. So can you imagine that what kind of requirement that is? Now, today, you say, that's not too big a deal. I invite you to go copy all 5 books of the first 5 books of the Old Testament. And I want you to do so with a oil-fired lamplight in a room with no air conditioning and no heat. And I want you to do it with a pen that uses probably some kind of animal oil to be the ink in doing it. I want you to do that, and I want you to not make any mistakes. You'd make a ton of them. And you'd be working from a nice, neatly printed volume of the Bible printed on a printing press or on a copier or whatever that may wind up being, with all the letters are the same size. It's all in really neat lines and everything. It would be a lot of work to copy down biblical books. And it's one of the reasons why there's not that many of them. But we know it was important. For example, in the New Testament, we have over nearly 5,500 copies plus of various different parts of the New Testament. We know it was important. It was important for it to be copied. So when you copy something, you would know it very well. The king was supposed to know the law. That didn't happen as best we can tell because none of the kings really wind up being all that great at it. Josiah finds a copy. His people do the law. So we see in Ezekiel 7, Ezra described as that. Originally, scholars think they were copyists, and they eventually became experts in the law because of copying those things. I mean, copying a Torah, an entire edition of the Torah by hand, I mean, like you go commit part of your life to doing that from a scroll. But they did become skilled experts, and that's the picture that's painted in the New Testament. There does seem to be a shift in exile to scribes from the priesthood being all that important and being the people go to about the law, as it seems to be you would go consult the lawyer or scribe. Others also believe that they helped develop the hedges around the law. Now that's something, a phrase to be familiar with as we think about studying the New Testament. A lot of the things that the Pharisees and others did in their traditions, putting rules in place that may not be verbatim spelled out in the Hebrew Scriptures, is we're going to make up rules where you don't even come close to violating the law of God, right? For example, Jesus practices this when he says, you have heard it said that you will not commit adultery. But I'll tell you that a man who looks at a woman with lust in his eyes has already committed adultery with her in her heart. Now, there's no prohibition or prohibition, against looking at a woman with lust in your eyes in the Torah. There is a prescription against adultery. But if I don't ever look at a woman with lust in my eyes, what are the odds of me committing adultery? I'm just going to, by accident, commit adultery. Or I'm not going to murder my brother. I'm not going to murder Mike over here. I don't have any plans to murder you, by the way, Mike. You're a lot bigger than me. You probably take care of yourself. And then she would really hurt me if I did that. But if I'm never angry with him, if I never get angry at Mike, which I've never been angry at Mike, why would I ever kill him? And so Jesus also practices good advice on saying, why do we even want to come near breaking the law? But they went a little bit overboard in that day and time. Many times were saying, well, we don't want to violate the Sabbath, so we're not going to do this, or we're not going to do that. And I can understand why there was so much concern over that, because God gave very little to no information on what it meant to violate the Sabbath. He says, just keep the Sabbath. Okay, what does that mean? You shall do no work on that day. Well, what defines work? We know one story is some poor soul went out to pick up sticks in the Torah, and he gets stoned to death because of it. And so that's a violation of Sabbath. This guy probably just going to get him some firewood. And so, okay, how far are we going to walk on the Sabbath? How far are we going to do this? And so I understand us putting hedges around the law. We think we don't do that, but we do it in our preaching and teaching all the time. On saying, well, don't go near this, or don't do that, or keep yourself away from this. I put hedges around things in my own life. You know, I don't go to country western bars, because that's where I used to go and get drunk. So I don't go to those places anymore, because you know what? I can't go to one of those and not get drunk. It just the chances and odds are something I don't want to roll a dice on. You know, I keep myself away from places where women may be promiscuous. Because number one, I'd be divorced even without committing adultery if I did those things. But I don't go near those things because I don't go to singles parties with women. You know, there's things that you just don't do that we do to keep ourselves distant from sin. I struggle greatly with anger, really with rage I struggle with. So I do try to avoid certain things, like not driving at certain times of the day, to avoid that kind of rage, or just staying away from situations, or trying to keep myself distant from things that I know are going to frustrate me, and staying away from them. So I don't want us to view people as evil that do that, but just think they probably had good hearts trying to say, hey, we want to keep people away from violating God's law. So that was a lot about people. Let's talk about places. Something we don't know a lot about is the origins of the synagogue. Here we have it mentioned 55 times in the New Testament, so it is pretty handy. Many times in Luke and Acts, because, hey, as we're going to talk about in the coming weeks, where's the first place Paul goes when he gets to a town that has one? He goes to the synagogue, right? Because everybody there already believes in Yahweh. And they already maybe even know about the expectation of a Messiah. And they already hold the Word of God to be true and to be inspired and to be authoritative. Great. At least I'm already starting off. When I go to the Gentiles, I don't have any of those advantages. And so it makes sense to go and say, hey, look, I'm going to tell you about the guy that our scriptures have told us about. Well, number one, they believe in the scriptures. There's no such word as scriptures in Greek, because the Greeks and the Romans didn't have any scriptures. Their gods didn't give them a set of rules to write down. And so synagogue, very, very important in the gospel message. The word means gathering or assembly. And so that could be even translated that way, synagogue. We have obscure origins. We don't know where it came from. We know they didn't exist in what we call the Old Testament narrative period. Some believe they came from a prosuke, which is like a house of prayer that eventually evolved into a place that was used for a lot of different things. Religious purposes, maybe community purposes along those lines. It had religious function. Obviously, we see even Jesus reading from the prophets in the Sabbath reading in the synagogue in Capernaum. We see, like I said, Paul going to these synagogues often on the Sabbath day. Worship services that they may have done compared to our modern day worship services, I don't think they're the same that we would think of them having liturgy and reading and probably prayer and certain things that are read or said in there. But also you had social functions. It was kind of like a community center in some ways, and also local judicial issues. You go get them settled in the synagogue. We're accustomed to having lots of different buildings to go do things in. Now, the Jews may have had a limited number of buildings to do things in, and your houses were not all that large. So it's a multifunctional place. In the New Testament, we see the synagogue as a center of teaching, preaching, liturgical readings, meaning readings from the law or the prophets or the Psalms, which still goes on today in synagogues. Legal proceedings happen there, and even locations for corporal punishment, people getting beaten. of interest in James chapter 2, we think about are unclean allowed into a synagogue, and is that what James is talking about? James uses the Greek word synagoge, and I think almost in the same way of saying ecclesia, or the assembly of Christians. James is a very, very Jewish book, very, very Torah-oriented, Torah-keeping oriented, and so it's interesting he uses that word, and he talks about unclean people being allowed. If you were unclean, for example, you're a leper, somebody like that, or a woman who is still in her menstrual cycle, or if you just had a baby, or you touched a dead body, a lot of reasons you wouldn't be able to maybe be allowed into a synagogue. Well, okay, now I know what time it is. About time. Look at that. Look how synchronous that was. Aren't you impressed? We also think about the Sanhedrin, something we see mentioned often in the New Testament, especially around the time of Jesus' trial, so-called trial. It's mentioned 22 times in the New Testament, only once in John, and it's translated most often as council. In this word Sanhedrin, translated into a council. We do know that its origins, we think, were in the Hasmonean period, that period between 167 and 63 BCE, when the Jews ruled themselves. Herod the Great's probably like an extension of that era, but that's when we think the Sanhedrin came together. Literally, it means seated together. The word means, in its original language, is seated together. A lot of people. I cannot imagine dealing with a council of 70 to 71 people, but a lot of people. Scholars think the origins of that are of the 70 some odd elders that are gathered in Exodus chapter 24 and Numbers chapter 11. I don't know how you'd ever get anybody to agree on anything, but I think a lot of times we see Sanhedrin in a movie, or I haven't watched all The Chosen. I've been trying to get myself into that, and I really can't get into it, but I'm working on it. But in a movie, whatever, it seems like the Sanhedrin's like 5 people. You know, it's just like the high priest and like 6 or 7 people are making this decision. But you see a wide range of people here and high in number. This is information that we get from places outside of the New Testament. They're involved in judicial and civil affairs, the administration of the temple, probably a lot of Sadducees, some Pharisees, some other Jewish sects on that. They kind of control the calendar a little bit. Keep in mind that day and time. Somebody's got to walk out the door that night and say, oh, it's a new moon, so this is the day the month starts. And looking through that, they also had, it seems, a police force that they send after Jesus, but they do have a limited authority, right? They're not able to put Jesus to death. They say, we got to go before the Romans and do that. Now, it's interesting. They didn't hesitate to stone poor old Stephen to death without going and getting permission from the Roman government to do that, but maybe that's just kind of a mob rule mentality. But they do have a limited amount of authority. In the New Testament, affiliations of people in the Sanhedrin are priests, Pharisees, Sadducees, elders, and some scribes as well. So a lot of different people on this council. I think Joseph of Arimathea is described as a prominent member of the council. You're probably talking about your upper echelon people as well, maybe some people of some wealth and of some means. Well, maybe I've lost track of being able to move my slides. Okay, well, I guess that's the end of our presentation tonight in talking about that, but it may be, I think it's my last slide, isn't it? Yeah. I'm getting to that. I don't have any homework for you tonight, is that way. I hope that this has been a lot, but let me encourage you, some of those books I showed to you earlier on in the class, and if you don't have them, I'm glad to email me, let me know, I'll send those things to you. This information is easily accessible, probably even for free online if you didn't want to buy a book. Now, I always tell people that everything you get online is worth every penny that you pay for it. So I encourage you to invest in some scholarly books, good academic sources to talk about these things. Don't necessarily go to some quack on YouTube and learn about these. But there are good things on YouTube and other places out there that are good, reliable resources to learn more about. So if you don't remember all this tonight, that's fine. I just wanted you to kind of get an idea as we look through it of just the width and breadth of Jewish religion and how complicated it was in the first century. And once again, thinking about how important it is that we have to educate ourselves on the social, cultural, and religious context of the time that we are reading the Scriptures, whether we're reading Moses, or we're reading about David, or we're reading about Ezra, or we're reading about Jesus, or Paul, or Rome, or whatever that winds up being. It's not the 21st century United States. And anybody that, it's not the 18th century United States. It's never the United States. It's not even Western culture. And so it's important for us to understand those things as we delve into our Bible study. Because when you interpret the Bible based on Christian religious traditions or teachings of particular church traditions, you will invariably fall into false teachings when we don't understand those things as they recur. So, all right, we will get busy on some of Paul's journeys next week. You guys be safe. I hope we don't have too bad of weather. We hope to see you here Sunday and everything be okay for that. If something was to be terribly bad, we do have some contingencies in mind for that. The elders don't, but the staff does. And so we think ahead a little bit. But we hope to all see you here on Sunday morning. It's good to see y'all tonight.